Teenager spits chewing gum on Royal Guard's boot. What he did next made headlines. What if I told you that a single moment of teenage rebellion would change 2 lives forever, and teach an entire nation about dignity, respect, and the power of quiet strength? On a crisp autumn morning outside Buckingham Palace, 17-year-old Tyler Harrison thought he was just another face in the crowd of tourists. He'd been dragged along on this London trip by his grandmother, rolling his eyes at every historical site she insisted on visiting. Standing there watching the stoic royal guards, Tyler felt that familiar surge of defiance that had been getting him into trouble back home in Ohio. The guard before him stood perfectly still, his red uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable beneath the tall black hat. Tyler worked the piece of spearmint gum in his mouth, feeling the eyes of other tourists on him as he stepped closer to the ceremonial post. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones and shared across the world, but the real story, the one that mattered, wouldn't be told until much later. Where are you watching from tonight? Tyler Harrison had never wanted to come to London. At 17, he'd rather be anywhere else than trailing behind his 72-year-old grandmother Rose through what she called the greatest city on earth. Rose had saved for 3 years to take this trip, her late husband's dream that she was determined to fulfill in his memory. She'd invited Tyler not just for company, but because she worried about the angry young man he'd become since his parents' messy divorce 2 years ago. The morning had already been tense. Tyler had complained about the early wake-up call, the crowded tube, and the boring old buildings Rose insisted on photographing. She'd bitten her tongue, remembering how her own teenage years had felt impossible, how the world had seemed determined to misunderstand her at every turn. Now, standing outside Buckingham Palace, she watched her grandson with growing concern as he deliberately positioned himself near the Royal Guard's post. The guard was Corporal James Mitchell, 25 years old, though his solemn expression made him appear older. He'd been standing at his post for 47 minutes, trained to remain absolutely motionless despite the chatter of tourists, the flash of cameras, and the occasional attempt by visitors to get a reaction. James had joined the Queen's Guard 3 years ago, following a family tradition that stretched back generations. His great-grandfather had served, his grandfather had served, and his father had served with distinction. For James, the uniform represented more than duty, it embodied honor, sacrifice, and an unbroken chain of service to something greater than himself. Tyler approached the guard with calculated insolence, that particular brand of teenage defiance that feels like rebellion but often masks deeper pain. He'd been acting out since the divorce, pushing boundaries at school, testing his grandmother's patience, searching for something solid to push against in a world that suddenly felt unstable. The other tourists began to notice his behavior, some stepping back uncomfortably, others raising their phones in anticipation. Rose felt her heart sink as she recognized the look in her grandson's eyes. It was the same expression he'd worn the day he'd been suspended from school, the same stubborn set to his jaw when he'd screamed at his mother that he didn't care about anyone or anything. She started to move toward him, but something held her back. Perhaps the instinct that this moment needed to unfold, that some lessons could only be learned through experience. Tyler worked the gum in his mouth, feeling the weight of attention around him. In his teenage mind, this was about proving something, that authority figures were just pretending, that respect was something you had to earn, that these ceremonial soldiers with their fancy uniforms were nothing more than tourist attractions. He'd been disappointed by every adult in his life lately. Why should this stranger be any different? James, trained to maintain his position regardless of provocation, felt the familiar challenge that came with his duty. He'd faced drunk tourists, crying children, and endless attempts to make him laugh or flinch. But something about this teenager felt different. There was pain behind the anger, a vulnerability that James recognized from his own difficult moments growing up in a military family where showing weakness felt like failure. The crowd around them had grown larger, sensing drama. Some tourists moved closer with their cameras ready, while others backed away, uncomfortable with the tension building in the autumn air. Rose watched her grandson with a mixture of love and heartbreak, seeing in his defiant posture the little boy who used to run to her for comfort when the world felt too big and scary. Tyler took another step closer to the guard, close enough now to see the individual threads in the red wool uniform, close enough to notice the slight tension in the man's jaw that suggested he was very much aware of what was happening. For a moment, something flickered in Tyler's chest, a recognition that this wasn't just a statue or a tourist attraction, but a real person doing a real job. But the anger was louder than the empathy, and he'd come too far to back down now. He removed the gum from his mouth, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as the crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath. The morning sun caught the saliva-slick surface of the pink gum, and for one suspended moment, everything was perfectly still. James remained at attention, his training holding him steady even as he processed what was about to happen. Rose whispered a quiet prayer, hoping that whatever was coming might somehow lead her grandson toward wisdom rather than deeper trouble. Tyler leaned forward and deliberately pressed the chewing gum against the polished black leather of the guard's boot, grinding it in with a twist of his heel. The crowd reacted with gasps and murmurs of disapproval, phones capturing every second of what they assumed would be either an explosive reaction or continued stoic silence. But what happened next would surprise everyone present, especially Tyler himself, and set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything the angry teenager thought he knew about strength, honor, and the quiet power of true dignity. The pink gum clung to the black leather like a small act of vandalism against centuries of tradition. Tyler stepped back, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and immediate regret that he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some tourists shaking their heads in disgust, others whispering about disrespectful Americans. But Corporal James Mitchell didn't move, didn't even blink. His training had prepared him for far worse provocations than this. Rose felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her grandson's face cycle through emotions, defiance melting into uncertainty, then hardening again into defensive anger. She recognized the pattern from countless family dinners where Tyler would lash out and then retreat into sullen silence rather than face the consequences of his actions. She wanted to rush forward, to apologize on his behalf, but something in the guard's absolute stillness made her pause. Minutes ticked by. Other tourists began to drift away, their interest waning when no dramatic confrontation materialized. But a small core group remained, sensing that something significant was unfolding in this strange standoff between a troubled teenager and an immovable soldier. Tyler found himself trapped in his own challenge, unable to walk away but increasingly uncomfortable with the guard's complete lack of reaction. James, beneath his disciplined exterior, was thinking about his younger brother Danny, who'd struggled with similar anger after their father's death in Afghanistan. He remembered the family meetings, the school suspensions, the night Danny had spray-painted graffiti on their local war memorial in what he'd later tearfully admitted was an attempt to hurt something that mattered, because he was hurting too. Their mother had made Danny spend weekends cleaning the memorial until it shone, not as punishment but as a way to understand what he'd really been attacking. The tourist who'd been filming began to lower his phone, the anticipated drama failing to materialize. But then something unexpected happened. James, still maintaining perfect posture, began to speak. His voice was quiet, meant only for Tyler, though several nearby tourists strained to listen. "My brother was about your age when he did something similar," James said, his words barely audible above the London traffic. Angry at the world, angry at everyone in uniform, angry at everything that seemed to represent order when his life felt like chaos. Tyler's cocky expression faltered. He hadn't expected the guard to speak at all, much less to speak with such gentle understanding. The anger that had been sustaining him began to crack, revealing the confusion and pain underneath. "He'd lost our father," James continued, his eyes still fixed straight ahead, "and he thought that giving someone like me trouble would somehow balance the scales. Make the world hurt the way he was hurting." Rose moved closer, drawn by the quiet intensity of the guard's words. She could see Tyler's defenses crumbling, the angry teenager giving way to the confused, grieving boy she'd been trying to reach for months. "The thing is," James said, "the uniform isn't about me. It's about service. About standing for something bigger than your own pain. And when you attack it, you're not really attacking me. You're attacking the idea that there's still honor in the world, still people willing to stand guard over things that matter." Tyler's hands began to tremble. The simple truth in the guard's words cut through all his carefully constructed justifications. He thought about his father, who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before the divorce destroyed their family. He thought about his own pain, how he'd been trying to spread it around like a virus, hoping that if everyone else hurt too, maybe his own hurt would feel less overwhelming. The moment stretched between them, loaded with possibility. Other tourists had stopped to listen now, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Rose held her breath, watching her grandson's face as understanding dawned. But then Tyler's phone buzzed with a text from his mother, asking if he was behaving himself on the trip. The reminder of home, of all the disappointment and conflict waiting for him there, made his walls slam back into place. The vulnerability James had accessed disappeared behind a fresh surge of defensive anger. "Whatever," Tyler muttered, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "It's just a stupid boot. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." The power of quiet dignity in the face of anger is something we could all learn from. But James wasn't finished. As Tyler turned to walk away, the guard made a decision that would change everything. He took one measured step forward, breaking from his position for the first time in hours. The crowd gasped, phones rose again, and Tyler froze mid-step, suddenly understanding that something significant was about to happen. Tyler turned back slowly, his face pale with the sudden realization that the guard's movement meant something serious was happening. Breaking from position wasn't something these soldiers did lightly, and the gathering crowd seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. James stood at ease now, his formal posture relaxed but his dignity intact, the pink gum still visible on his boot like a small badge of Tyler's shame. "Son," James said, and the word carried weight that Tyler felt in his chest. No one had called him son in months, not since his father had moved out and their relationship had devolved into awkward weekend visits and stilted phone calls. "I need you to understand something before you walk away." Rose stepped closer, her heart breaking as she watched her grandson struggle between the urge to run and something deeper that was keeping his feet planted on the sidewalk. She could see the boy Tyler had been before the divorce, before the anger had eaten away at his natural kindness. Other tourists formed a loose semicircle, their phones forgotten as they witnessed what felt like a private moment playing out in public. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it where Tyler could see. A picture of a soldier in desert camouflage, grinning at the camera with the same stubborn chin that Tyler saw in his own mirror every morning. "This was my father," James said quietly. "Sergeant Major Robert Mitchell. Lost him in Helmand Province when I was 16. Tyler's angry facade cracked visibly. His own father had served in the same region, had come home changed in ways that eventually destroyed their family. The parallel hit him like a physical blow, and he found himself looking, really looking, at James for the first time, seeing not just a uniform but a person carrying his own grief. "After he died," James continued, "I was furious. Not just sad, angry at everyone and everything. I spray-painted lies across our town's war memorial one night, right across the names of local soldiers who died in service. Thought I was making some kind of statement about the meaninglessness of sacrifice." The crowd around them was completely silent now, drawn into the raw honesty of James's confession. Rose felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her grandson's rigid posture begin to soften, his hands unclenching at his sides. "My mother found out, of course. But instead of punishing me, she made me research every name on that memorial. Made me learn their stories, their families, their dreams. Made me understand that my pain didn't give me the right to diminish their memory or mock their sacrifice." Tyler's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What happened then?" "Then I spent every weekend for 6 months cleaning that memorial. Not because I had to, the community had already fixed my damage, but because I needed to. I needed to understand what I'd really been attacking." James paused, studying Tyler's face. "I was angry at death, son. Angry at loss. But I was taking it out on honor, on service, on the very things my father had died to protect." The weight of recognition settled on Tyler like a heavy coat. He thought about his own father, about the man who'd come home from war carrying invisible wounds that eventually poisoned everything he touched. Tyler had been so focused on his anger at his father's failures that he'd forgotten the courage it had taken to serve in the first place, the sacrifice his father had made long before the family fell apart. "I'm not saying the uniform makes me special," James continued. But it represents something bigger than my personal problems. When you attack it, you're not just attacking me. You're attacking the idea that some things are worth standing for, worth protecting, worth preserving even when the world feels like it's falling apart. Tyler looked down at the gum on James's boot, seeing it now not as an act of rebellion but as a symptom of his own brokenness. The shame felt overwhelming, but underneath it was something else, a recognition that he'd been carrying his pain alone for too long, trying to push everyone away when what he really needed was to understand that others had walked this difficult path before him. My father. Tyler started, then stopped, his voice catching. My father served too. He came back different. Everything fell apart after that, and I blamed him for not being strong enough to handle whatever happened over there. Rose moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her grandson's shoulder. She'd been waiting for this moment, this crack in his armor that might finally let healing begin. But maybe, Tyler continued, his voice stronger now, maybe I've been angry at the wrong things. Maybe I've been angry at him for being human instead of being grateful that he was brave enough to serve in the first place. James nodded slowly. Pain makes us do foolish things, son. But recognizing it is the first step toward doing better. The crowd around them began to disperse as people sensed the private nature of what was unfolding. But Tyler remained frozen in place, staring at the evidence of his misdirected anger and feeling the full weight of what he needed to do next. Have you ever faced something like this, a moment when you realized your anger was really grief in disguise? Let us know in the comments. Tyler knelt down beside James's boot, his hands shaking as he tried to pick at the stubborn gum with his fingernails. But it had hardened in the London air, becoming a permanent mark that wouldn't be easily removed. As he knelt there in his inadequate attempt to undo his damage, Tyler finally understood that some actions can't be simply erased, they can only be transformed into something better through the difficult work of making amends. Tyler's fingernails were useless against the hardened gum, and his increasingly frantic attempts to remove it only seemed to make it worse. His face burned with embarrassment as tourists walked by, some pausing to watch the strange scene of a teenager desperately trying to clean a royal guard's boot while the soldier stood patiently above him. It's not coming off, Tyler said, his voice thick with frustration and shame. He looked up at James with desperate eyes. I'm making it worse. James reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a small packet of wet wipes, standard issue for maintaining uniform appearance during long shifts. He handed one to Tyler without a word, then knelt down beside him, his red wool tunic contrasting sharply with the grey London pavement. The sight of the royal guard on his knees beside a teenager sent murmurs through the nearby crowd, but James seemed oblivious to the attention. Together, they worked at the gum, James's practiced movements guiding Tyler's clumsy attempts. The simple act of cleaning side by side created an intimacy that cut through all the barriers that had existed between them moments before. When I was cleaning that memorial, James said quietly as they worked, my mother told me something I've never forgotten. She said that true honor isn't about being perfect, it's about facing your mistakes with courage and doing the hard work to make things right. Tyler nodded, not trusting his voice. The gum was finally beginning to soften under their combined efforts, small pieces coming away on the wet cloth. But more than the physical cleaning was happening here, Tyler could feel something inside himself being restored as well, some sense of dignity he'd lost along the way. Rose watched from a few feet away, tears streaming freely now as she witnessed her grandson's transformation. This was the boy she remembered from before the pain had twisted him into someone angry and unreachable. This was the Tyler who used to help her in her garden, who cried when they passed injured animals on the road, who had always been quick to defend anyone he saw being treated unfairly. My father would have liked you, Tyler said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. Before everything went wrong, I mean. He always said that honor meant standing up when it was hard, not when it was easy. James smiled for the first time, his formal composure softening into something more human. He sounds like a good man who faced something terrible and did his best with it. He was, Tyler whispered, and in saying it, he felt the first real forgiveness he'd been able to offer his father in 2 years. He really was. They worked in comfortable silence for several more minutes, until the last traces of gum were gone. James's boot wasn't perfectly pristine. There was still a small dark spot where the gum had been. But it was clean, and more importantly, the act of cleaning it together had created something new between them. As they stood, James adjusted his uniform and prepared to resume his post. But Tyler caught his sleeve, stopping him for just a moment longer. "I need to tell you something," Tyler said, his voice stronger now but still shaking slightly. "My name is Tyler Harrison. I'm from Dayton, Ohio. My father is Sergeant Michael Harrison, and he served 2 tours in Iraq. He's struggling now, and our family fell apart because of it, and I've been angry about that for so long that I forgot to be proud of him too." James extended his hand, and Tyler shook it firmly, man to man. "Corporal James Mitchell, and it's been an honor to meet you, Tyler Harrison, son of Sergeant Michael Harrison." The formal introduction felt like a ceremony, a recognition that they'd both been changed by this encounter. Rose approached them, her face glowing with pride and relief. "You've given my grandson something precious today," she told James. "You've given him back his respect for service, for honor, and I think for himself too." James resumed his position, his bearing once again perfectly erect, but something in his expression remained softer than before. Tyler and Rose prepared to continue their tour, but not before Tyler made one final gesture. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales like this one. Tyler pulled out his phone and deleted the angry text he'd started to send to his father earlier that morning, a message full of resentment about the child support payment being late again. Instead, he typed something different. "Dad, I'm in London with Grandma Rose. Thinking about your service today and feeling proud. Love you." He hit send before he could change his mind, knowing that healing would require many small acts of courage just like this one. 3 months later, Tyler sat in his bedroom in Dayton, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning with a London postmark. Inside was a photograph of Buckingham Palace taken from the exact spot where he'd met James, along with a handwritten note on official letterhead. "Tyler," the note read, "I wanted you to know that your story has become something of a legend among the guards here. Not the part about the gum, that's been forgotten. But the part about a young man who had the courage to face his mistakes and do the hard work of making things right. That kind of character is what real honor looks like." Tyler smiled, remembering that day in London with perfect clarity. The tourist photos and videos had indeed made headlines, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The story that spread wasn't about a disrespectful teenager acting out, but about a moment of grace between 2 people carrying similar pain, and the healing that happened when one person's anger met another person's patient dignity. The trip to London had marked a turning point for Tyler in ways he couldn't have imagined. When he and Rose returned home, he'd found the courage to have real conversations with both his parents. Difficult, honest talks about the war, the divorce, and the anger that had been eating away at all of them. His father had cried when Tyler asked him about his service, not the bitter tears of a man haunted by memories, but the healing tears of someone finally able to share his burden with his son. Tyler's relationship with his father wasn't magically fixed overnight. There were still awkward moments, still pain that would take years to fully heal. But they'd found a foundation to build on, a mutual respect that acknowledged both his father's courage in serving and his struggle in coming home. They'd started attending counseling sessions together, working through the complicated grief that military families often carry. At school, Tyler had become a different person as well. The angry edge that had gotten him into so much trouble had been replaced by something steadier, more purposeful. He joined the school's peer mediation program, discovering that his own experience with pain made him uniquely qualified to help other students work through their conflicts. His grades improved, not because he'd suddenly become brilliant, but because he'd found reasons to care about his future again. Rose often caught him looking at the photograph from London that now sat framed on his desk. Sometimes he'd tell her about conversations he'd had with his father, about plans they were making to visit some of the war memorials his father had never felt strong enough to see. Tyler had suggested they start with the local memorial in Dayton, the one where his father's name would someday be added to honor his service, regardless of how his story ended. The most significant change, though, was in Tyler's understanding of strength itself. Before London, he'd equated strength with hardness, with the ability to hurt others before they could hurt you. But James had shown him a different kind of strength, the strength to stand still in the face of provocation, to meet anger with understanding, to remain dignified when others tried to diminish you. Tyler had written back to James several times, sharing updates about his family and his plans for the future. He decided to apply for ROTC programs at several colleges, not because he was certain about a military career, but because he wanted to understand the tradition of service that both his father and James represented. He wanted to learn about honor from people who lived it daily. In his latest letter to James, Tyler had written about a moment that happened just the week before. He'd been at a basketball game when he saw a younger student being bullied by a group of older boys. The old Tyler might have walked by, not wanting to get involved, or worse, might have joined in to prove his own toughness. But instead, he'd stepped in calmly, using words instead of fists, and helped diffuse the situation without anyone getting hurt or humiliated. "I kept thinking about how you stood there that day," Tyler had written to James. "How your strength wasn't about what you could do to me, but about what you chose not to do. How you met my anger with something better. I'm trying to learn that kind of strength myself." James's response had been brief but meaningful. "That's exactly what your father's service was about too. Choosing to stand between others and harm, even when it cost him something. You're honoring his sacrifice by learning to serve others in your own way." Tyler folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Tonight, his father was coming over for dinner, something that had become a weekly tradition since London. They would talk about Tyler's college applications, about his father's progress in therapy, about small, everyday things that felt precious because they'd almost lost the chance to share them. Rose called from downstairs that dinner was ready, her voice warm with the contentment that came from seeing her family healing. Tyler stood up, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that unconsciously echoed a certain Royal Guards posture, and headed downstairs to continue the slow, important work of building a life based on honor rather than anger. The teenager who had spit gum on a guard's boot was gone, replaced by a young man who understood that true rebellion sometimes meant choosing respect over defiance, healing over hurt, and hope over despair. And in London, Corporal James Mitchell continued to stand his post, knowing that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with patience, dignity, and the quiet courage to meet darkness with light. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales about the power of human connection and the courage to change. Thank you for joining us on Tyler's journey from anger to understanding. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen in the smallest moments, when one person's grace meets another person's pain, and something beautiful grows from that meeting.